Look, guys, Tom Aspinall was the lock of the week. I said he would have a great first round and eventually capitalize on the damage that he puts on Sirigan to eventually beat a compromised Sirigan throughout the fight. But if we're keeping it real, Tom Aspinall was looking like he was about to lose that fight before the eye poke. And we obviously don't know how the rest of the fight was going to play out. But from what we saw, it was all in Cyril Gunn's favor. It looked like he was in control of the distance, landing the heavier, more damaging shots. He was doing what he did to everyone: speed and power, and jabbing in and out. And it looked like Tom was pretty much lost in there. Okay, I wouldn't say lost in there. It was kind of competitive, but I just felt like Cyril Gahn was much more in control. And if we're judging based off of damage and volume as well, Gahn was winning that fight. If Francis Ngannou couldn't touch Gahn and Gahn was jabbing up Tom for as long as the fight lasted, it just leads me to believe that Gahn was going to win that fight eventually. Something else I wanted to talk about in that fight card was the Jacqueline Amarim fight. Go back and watch my breakdown. I legit said Mizuki would keep it on the feet and outstrike her, but I picked Jacqueline to win because I was peer pressured by all of you. Honestly, if I think a huge underdog is gonna win, I'm just gonna say it. I don't even care anymore. I could have looked so cool picking Mizuki to win, and I would have had that infinite aura, but I gave in to the peer pressure. So what else? Oh yeah, Maxim. He's probably the worst fighter on the UFC roster. He needs to get cut ASAP. He sold the ultimate lock and the most confident pick section. The safety lock, Umar alone hits, the iron lock hits, the fun duo parlay. There were two very close fights. I feel like there was arguments to be made for both of those fights to go the other way. And how about that underdog city parlay? Azamat and Killian both getting some brutal knockouts for underdog plus money. That was a fun one because many people were on the other side of that one. But many people were on the other side of both guys, and they just shut everyone's doubts up. So I'm telling y'all, like, Killian is the future. He's a future contender. I've been saying that. But let's move on. Let's move on to this card. I haven't been disappointed in the card in so long. I mean, this is just so disappointing. Having this as the main event, we're really being given this as the full card. You might as well just skip this week and not have anyone tune in. Like, the only fighter I'm truly excited about is an underdog, Yadir Del Valle. I think he's gonna pull off a huge upset win. I'm gonna say it right now. I actually picked a bunch of underdogs in this card without even realizing it, but frick it. Mizuki pick would have been legendary if I didn't get peer pressured by everyone to switch my pick to Jacqueline. But let's continue on with these picks. So I hope you guys are doing well. Welcome to this week's prediction episode of UFC Fight Night Steve Garcia versus David Onama, where I'll be breaking down and predicting every fight on the card. So let's dive into the first fight of the night. We got Alice Ardeline versus Montserrat Ruiz. I'm gonna pick Alice Ardeline to win. I'm gonna say she uses her length and her reach to keep this fight on the feet and basically outpoint Ruiz, landing the better shots on the feet. I feel like Alice has turned a new leaf in her career. She seems so much more motivated to win, especially in her last fight. I think she was saying she made a promise to her grandma that she was going to win her next fight, and then her grandma ended up dying, or it was something like that. And as a massive underdog in her last fight, she ended up winning versus Ryan Dos Santos, which kind of surprised me because in most of her fights, she just eats shots and keep coming forward. But last time she was more aggressive in trying to put up more volume. She bit down on her mouthpiece and kept throwing and won her fight and fulfilled her promise to her grandma. And when someone makes a promise like that, they're pretty much a dangerous fighter. And now fighting a 5 foot Montserrat Ruiz, it's gonna be so difficult for Ruiz to get her game going against a highly motivated, reinvigorated Alice Ardeline. Ruiz is primarily a striker, and some of the worst part of Ardeline's game is Ardeline's striking defense. Ruiz needs to try and use her wrestling, but I see her being undersized in this matchup, being outpointed and outmuscled by the bigger, stronger fighter in Ardeline, who can use her strength to keep this on the feet. And I think she'll be able to outpoint her in the striking. Alice is primarily a striker. Although she has poor striking defense, it won't be easy for Ruiz to exploit that here, with her short frame and while also being primarily a wrestler. Plus, Alice is so resilient. Even if she gets hit, she never gives up on herself, and she continues to press forward and land shots. So, not to mention, Montserrat Ruiz is on a three-fight losing streak, getting TKO'd 3 fights in a row. This division is just eating her up, and Ruiz is going to want to close the distance and use her wrestling to get this fight on the ground, but she's going to try to take advantage of Alice's poor striking defense, but I think Alice will have a much more volume in her strikes, be the harder puncher as well, control the distance easily against a much smaller fighter who needs this fight on the ground. And Alice can definitely make it 4 TKO victories or losses in a row for Ruiz. On top of that, Ruiz hasn't fought in 2 years, almost 2 years, about 2 years, right? I can imagine she comes. I can't imagine she comes back as a brand new fighter. We've seen her ceiling, and while Ruiz is on the downhill trend in her career, it just seems like Alice might have turned a new leaf and is on the uphill trend of her career. So I'm just gonna say that Alice uses her length, her reach. She's coming in motivated for this fight, and she has heavy pressure in her strikes. Who can outwork such a smaller opponent in Montserrat? So I think Montserrat is just way too short and wrestle wrestle dependent in this fight. She needs to close the distance and grind, but I just think Alice is gonna keep it long and outpoints her and negates any of Ruiz's size dependent wrestling. You know what I mean? Like she's too small to in order to get her wrestling going. So pick is gonna be Alice Ardeline. Moving on to our next fight of the night, we got Charlie Radtke versus was it Daniel Frunza. I'm gonna pick Charlie Radtke to win this fight. I think in an explosive first and second round, I'm gonna say Charlie lands the better and cleaner, more devastating shots and does enough to win the fight overall. Charlie Radtke, I think he should be able to handle Frunza here. Radtke isn't bad, but he certainly isn't an elite fighter. His only two losses in the UFC are to Carlos Prates and Mike Malott, which are really good strikers. We saw the hand speed and power Malott had in his last fight versus Kevin Holland. I picked Malott to beat Holland and picked Malott to beat Radtke as well. To lose to Malott isn't a bad loss in my opinion. Obviously, having that loss to Carlos Prates isn't a bad loss either. So other than those two losses, Radtke has looked good, and Daniel Frunza really hasn't shown anything too impressive. He won on the Contender Series as an underdog, but his opponent gassed out in like the middle of the first round. Then for his UFC debut, Frunza gets dominated by Reese McGee, who isn't a great fighter himself. McGee knocked Frunza down 4 times in that first round. Landing clean, accurate punches on him, and Frunza showed heart and resilience to keep getting up and keep fighting, getting rocked over and over again. Getting his face busted up, but the doctor had to put an end to it because of how badly Frunza's face was getting beat up. And that gave Reese McGee his first UFC win. And if it wasn't for that win, McGee would be 0-5 in the UFC. He's now 1-5 because of that win over Frunza. Which shows McGee isn't really that UFC level. And yeah, it shows McGee isn't really high level in the as a UFC athlete, and if he's able to do that to Frunza, coming up against Charlie Radtke, who has legitimate UFC wins, and he's losing to high caliber fighters, I think Charlie's gonna land the cleaner shots and find a knockout in this matchup. Frunza is primarily a striker. He's gonna want to stand and bang. He's aggressive and he's willing to fight in a brawl, but that can cost him. He's vulnerable to being pressured back. And someone like Radtke is going to move forward as well, apply some high pressure with dangerous knockout power. And I don't think Frunza is high level enough to take advantage of Radtke coming forward to find a counter shot or anything like that. This fight is going to be a war. Both guys coming forward, but Radtke has looked more impressive against higher level competition and has lost to better competition than the guys who Frunza is losing to. Frunza is also not the best defensive wrestler, and Radtke is well-rounded enough to be able to use his wrestling if he has to in a matchup like this. I think the pace of Radtke is going to be too overwhelming, and he's going to win more moments when it comes to the brawling moments of this fight, right? So I just think Charlie has that heavy hitting pressure as a striker, and he's proven at the UFC level versus solid contenders. While Daniel Frunza, he's more of just an aggressive brawler. He has been rocked badly before against not the best opposition, and his durability is certainly a question. So I just think Charlie is going to be landing the cleaner power shots and have better moments pressuring in this matchup. He likely lands the fight ending shot, and he's going to be landing the fight changing moments, the shots that lead the fight into his favor, right? So pick is Charlie Radtke in this matchup. Moving on to Donte Johnson versus Sedriqus Dumas. That's not Donte Johnson, that's Phantom. You can't tell me Phantom doesn't look like Donte Johnson. This is actually Donte Johnson. If you guys know who Phantom is, he's friends with Kai Cenat. Anyways, I'm picking Donte Phantom Johnson to win this fight. I'm picking Phantom to win this fight. I'm gonna say Donte moves forward in the first round and finds the knockout. Finds the knockout home run shot early in a fireworks fight. Donte, um, he seems like a mother trucker, dude. That hurt like a butt cheek on a stick. He seems like an absolute tank. He just fought on the Contender Series just a couple weeks ago, and he knocked out someone like 7 inches taller than him. It almost looked like a mismatch just looking at the two guys and their height difference. But when it came skill for skill, it was a mismatch. And Donte, despite being the much smaller guy, was the much more superior striker. Donte knocked out his opponent with speed and aggressive power. And I like that he's active. He just fought a couple of weeks ago. He's carrying that momentum and the confidence coming into this matchup. He's fighting Sedriqus Dumas, who just seems more of like a point fighter. When it comes to this UFC level, I'm not going to say Sedriqus is a bad fighter because he's not. I just don't think he's as aggressive in looking for the finish. And I don't think he pushes a strong enough pace to phase someone like Donte, who's coming in and trying to rip your head off. Sedriqus doesn't hold any crazy counter abilities as well either. He has some good speed on his shots, and if he decides to get into a brawl here, he isn't going to be holding the more powerful shots. And he's shown to be vulnerable to opponents pressuring him back, like Nursultan Ruzaboyev and Michael Olenjacek. And he's been knocked out multiple times. He doesn't have a high enough ceiling to be a strong prospect like Phantom here. The first round is going to be a fight. The first round is going to be a fight of just fireworks. Both of them like to come out strong, but in a firefight like that, I definitely see Donte coming out on top, holding the much more devastating power in his hands. But if Dumas somehow manages to survive that storm in the first round, he might have a bit success just outpointing Donte, using his leg kicks, using his jab, try to win a decision. But I think it's only a matter of time before Donte finds the knockout shot, because he's going to be hunting him down, as soon as the bell starts. Donte has never been past the first round. He's never faced UFC level competition, and we don't know much about his grappling. But even with all that considered, we know he has devastating knockout power, and he's an aggressive starter who's coming to hunt his opponents down. I can't see Dumas managing that early storm. Despite being so much taller and longer than him, that doesn't phase Donte, as we've seen in his last fight. If he gets past the first round, Dumas is going to need to get this fight on the ground somehow, I believe, or outpoint him. But that's a tough ask. I can see Dumas being drawn into a brawl and getting knocked out in the first round, because Donte, he has that explosive, compact knockout threat at all times in the first round. He's an aggressive starter, and he's got that recent momentum from his recent knockout in the Contender Series. Fighting just a couple of weeks ago, and fighting someone like Dumas, who's going to be more of a volume and point striker, who's less aggressive for early finishes. I'm gonna side with Donte. It's gonna be early fireworks fight, favoring the smaller, heavier hitter chasing a finish. So I'm just going to say Donte lands that knockout shot. Phantom lands a knockout shot. Moving on to our next fight, Talitia Alencar versus Ariane Carnelossi. This was a tough pick, but I'm going to pick Carnelossi. I'm going to say she's able to keep it on the feet and for the most part of the fight, and land the more damaging shots on the feet. Talitia is a good fighter. Her loss to Stephanie Luciano Uh, her only loss is to Stephanie Luciano, I believe. Yeah, and Luciano looks like a high level athlete, so that's not a bad loss at all in my opinion. You know, she had a draw with her in the Contender Series, and then gets her takedown stuffed now and gets outlanded in the strikes in the rematch when they both get into the UFC. You know, and Stephanie Luciano is tall for that weight class. You know, she was towering over Talita, so Talita won't have to deal with that long length in this opponent with Carnelossi. You know, Talita is gonna try to use her strikes to, in order to set up her takedowns, because when she gets opponents on the ground, she has some high level grappling and is able to keep them on the ground. You know, she's always aiming to close the distance and move forward and get the takedowns. You know, and her striking isn't her main weapon. You know, she usually is finding success in the grappling, which can cost her because she usually uses her striking to set up her takedown. So if her striking isn't doing so well, she's struggling to get the takedowns. But on the other hand, Carnelossi, she has some decent striking. You know, I would say she definitely has the more power in her shots. You know, she's got some aggressive pressure, always moving forward with her strikes, and even mixes in her takedowns. You know, but Carnelossi can tend to slow down towards the later rounds, but this is pretty much the match of a striker versus a grappler. You know, Talita is going to look for the takedowns, establish some ground control, look for submissions, and avoid long periods of striking exchanges, but Carnelossi is going to want to close the distance with her strikes, force a brawl, put some damaging shots on Talita, and capitalize on Talita's striking weaknesses. And Talita can be rattled, you know, under pressure and go for panic to takedowns. You know, I think for judging based off of damage, I got Carnelossi in this one. You know, I think both ladies are going to have success implementing their game plan. You know, I can see Carnelossi landing damaging shots, and I can see Talita grabbing a single leg and pushing her up against the fence. But I think the more damaging shots will come from Carnelossi, and that's going to play a bigger part in the takedown attempts of from Talita. You know, I think the judges will be swayed more by the shots being landed than the pushing up against the fence type of game plan from Talita. So yeah, I just think Talita, she's more of a grappler first. She'll push for takedowns and top control, and her takedowns are reliant on her striking. You know, but I just think Carnelossi might be a better striker here, and she'll also push for takedowns and top control. And I just think Carnelossi has more power. You know, she's gonna press forward, but there's a chance she might fade late. You know, but I just think Carnelossi is going to be able to keep it standing for the most part, land the harder shots, and win this fight based off of damage. You know, moving on to our next fight, we got Isaac Dulgarian versus Yadir Del Valle. I'm siding with Yadir Del Valle to win this fight. You know, I'm gonna say in a high-paced fight where both guys are looking to get their grappling going, Del Valle is the one who lands the better shots on the feet, scrambles better in the wrestling exchanges, and is able to put up more volume in the striking. You know, this is the most underrated fight on the whole card, in my opinion. This is the fight to watch out for. You know, these two guys are both high level and dangerous. You know, in my opinion, both of these guys are undefeated. You know, Isaac Delgarian has that one loss to Christian Rodriguez, but I really think he was robbed in that fight. You know, I felt like he clearly beat Sirod in that fight. I haven't watched it in a while, but from what I remember, I just remembered thinking like Isaac Dalgarian should still be undefeated, you know, but it doesn't matter because I still see him losing in this matchup. You know, I'm high on Yadir Del Valle. I think he's so locked in, and he seems like the truth. You know, he's only had one fight in the UFC, and he won very easily. Whereas Isaac has had three fights in the UFC, and technically he won all of them, in my opinion. You know, Isaac is a great fighter. He has dominant wrestling and vicious ground and pound when he gets his opponents down, and he's an aggressive starter looking for the takedowns as soon as the fight starts. You know, his striking and cardio, they're a bit suspect. You know, he can slow down towards the later rounds and get outpointed in the strikes by high volume strikers, which is basically where some judges felt like he lost to Christian Rodriguez, who pretty much looked like the fresher fighter towards the end of the fight, landing the better strikes towards the end of the fight. But I felt like the control time and grappling was enough to override that, but he still lost, and that was the first time he went past the first round. You know, on the other hand, Yadir Del Valle has been to a decision four times in his career and has won every fight, whether he finishes them early or goes to the scorecards. His fights, his fights, he fights and looks like a tank. You know, he has some overwhelming striking, powerful kicks to set up the combinations in his strikes, dominant grappling as well, and he has high volume offense for 3 rounds. In his Contender Series fight, he went 3 rounds throwing numerous strikes and attempting multiple submissions. He can finish it early or grind out 3 hard rounds. There was a fight on the regional scene with Michael Aswell where he had a dominant first round, but in the third round he was getting taken down and he kind of showed fatigue. But that was after being so dominant in the early rounds. I think it'll be tough for Issac to secure takedowns early on Del Valle, or at least be able to hold him down for long periods of time. Both guys are going to try to get the grappling going early, and it might be so high of a pace where they both start to fade if no one finds a finish early. But in the striking, I favor Del Valle to land the better shots and have more volume as well. If he is able to keep it on the feet. Del Valle, he can scramble, outpoint him on the feet, and I'm going to say his cardio might just hold up better when it comes to a high-paced matchup like this. So I think Issac, he's more of a wrestler first with heavy top pressure and ground and pound, but I don't rate his cardio very highly, where someone like Del Valle is going to be high volume in his strikes. He's well-rounded, he's good at scrambling, and he's durable, and comfortable for 3 rounds. And I'm just going to say that Del Valle has more volume and scrambles better in the wrestling exchanges. And I think he's better conditioned in a dogged, high-paced fight. So I'm going to side with him to win this matchup. Yadir Del Valle. Moving on to our next fight. Norma Dumont versus Ketlen Vieira. I'm going to go with Norma Dumont to win this fight. I'm going to say Norma lands the better shots on the feet, presses Ketlen up against the fence and makes the better decisions throughout the fight, using her fight IQ to win this fight. I think Norma is a high-level fighter. I really like the way she moves around the octagon. She's smart, she's calculated, and she has nice snapping shots. She picks her shots well and doesn't brawl. I think now she's married to Marco Tulio, who's a dangerous rising prospect himself. So she's learning a lot from him as well. She's on a 5-fight win streak right now, and I think she really has sharp fight IQ, and she's only getting better. The only 2 losses she has came in the UFC, and they're both to really tall, lanky fighters who are difficult to deal with. Losing to Macy Cason by split decision and got knocked out by Megan Anderson almost 6 years ago. Both fighters are about 6 feet tall, and that's where she's had the most trouble in her career. Dealing with those types of long builds. But here she's not going to have that problem. Her skills are going to be able to be showcased nicely here against Ketlen. Norma striking, her grappling, it's going to be showcased. She's able to put up a good pace as well. Ketlen, she isn't a bad fighter. I don't see this being a walk in the park for Norma. Ketlen can have some nice, powerful strikes as well. She's looking for takedowns as well. She averages almost 1.5 takedowns per fight, and her takedown defense is high level as well. I think there's a difference here in the shot selection, though. I think Norma is the smarter fighter, with the better IQ. I think she will be making the better decisions here, landing the better shots, having better timing. And Ketlen is going to have to close the distance and make this an ugly fight. But Norma knows how to deal with those types of fighters. Anyone that wants to close the distance, Norma will just press them up against the fence, reverse position. And she has some heavy top control if she gets her opponents on the mat, and I feel like I said, I think she'll land the better shots and have the better shot selection. Ketlen is going to try and keep up a high pace, but I see her getting outworked here for the majority of the minutes of this fight. Right, so I just think Norma is going to be too smart for her, too much of a technical striker who picks her shots with good fight IQ and good pressure. Ketlen, she's powerful and she does mix in her takedowns with strikes, solid clinch wrestling, but I just think Norma is going to be sharper on the feet, outworks Vieira, and controls the key moments of this fight, winning her a decision here. Moving on to Timothy Cuamba versus Chang Ho Lee. I'm gonna pick Chang Ho Lee to win this fight. I'm not really too high on either of these guys. Timothy, he's a pretty well-rounded, dynamic striker with good technical striking. He's primarily a striker. He can slow down at times during fights. He finally got his first UFC win versus via flying knee in his last fight, which was really it was really a spectacular knockout, right? He something he needed in his career because he lost back to back decisions before that. On the other hand, Chang Ho Lee is primarily a grappler. He's got relentless pressure, sets up his takedowns with his strikes, and he's been looking good. On a five-fight win streak. I think his well-roundedness and his wrestling is good enough to wear down someone like Timothy Cuamba. Timothy is gonna want to maintain distance and strike from range, keep the fight on the feet to outstrike Chang Ho Lee, which can happen because uh, Chang Ho Lee can have some low striking output, but I think we're gonna see Chang Ho Lee shoot for multiple takedowns, control the fight with the grappling, and I also think his cardio is better as well. As the fight goes on, I think he'll become stronger, and Timothy might start to fade. Because while Timothy is a dynamic striker with flash knockout upside, I think he's still developing as a fighter, and developing cardio for 3 rounds. I think Chang Ho Lee is going to be relentless with his grappling, sets up his takedowns with his strikes. And I think he has the superior wrestling pace, so I'm going to say Chang Ho Lee grinds it out, gets takedowns and top control to drag down Kuamba's output. Moving on to our next fight. Billy Elekana versus Kevin Christian. I'm gonna pick Billy Elekana to win this fight. So Billy, he is a low volume striker. He's coming off of a really weird fight with Ibo Azan where they legit just stared at each other for 3 rounds straight. But Billy's a capable striker. He's got good takedown defense, good takedowns as well. It's hard to get a read on him. Because in his debut, he looked good. He got a takedown on Bogdan Grad, almost submitted him in the first round, but second round, he gets submitted. So Bailey's primarily a striker, though. He's looking to strike. He's fighting Kevin, who's 6'7", but in reality, he looks like 7 feet tall. This guy is huge. He can do it all. He's got knockout power. He's a submission specialist, massive size and reach, obviously, but he obviously doesn't have that UFC experience, and I don't think he's a high level fighter. In his last fight on the Contender Series, he was able to get he was able to really use his he wasn't able to really use his length and reach properly to his advantage. He wasn't really staying on the outside. He was getting caught with some punches, getting taken down in the first round, and he ended up finding a submission when his opponent gassed out. So Kevin didn't look good in this fight in the Contender Series, where as Billy actually showed something that was like impressive in his debut. Obviously in his last fight, it was slow and boring, and he had low output, but at least he was composed and patient and didn't gas himself out, right? So if he doesn't gas himself out here, I think he will have success landing the better shots on the feet. And I think Billy's ground game is good enough to avoid Kevin's submission attempts, because Kevin really isn't a high level fighter, or at least he hasn't shown to be one. Despite being so long and tall, I think we'll see Kevin lose the striking exchanges. Billy is a decent counter striker, and he can even control Kevin up against the cage, but and yeah, I'm just not that high on Kevin as a fighter. He's still unproven and hasn't shown anything spectacular. Not that Billy has been sensational or anything, but he's shown some decent fighting ability. Because Billy in his last fight, he had that low volume and boring fight, but I still think he's a composed counter striker with decent takedown defense. Kevin's gonna be massive in there long, and he's a submission hunting prospect, but I just think he's unproven at the UFC level. Unproven at the UFC level, So the pick has to be Billy Elekana. I think he's gonna be more composed. He's more proven as well at this level, and I think he's gonna be able to avoid those submissions from this big guy Kevin Christian. So moving on to our next fight, we got Alan Nascimento versus Rafael Estevam. I'm gonna pick Rafael Estevam to win this fight. I'm high on both fighters. I'm high on Alan Nascimento. I think he's a great fighter. I picked him to beat Jafil Filo in his last fight, but I'm even higher to on Rafael Estevam. There's no way I can pick against him in this matchup. He has shown to be nothing but perfect so far. Undefeated, and he has a win over Charles Johnson and Jesus Aguilar, which are great wins to have early in your UFC career. I think Alan Nascimento has looked really good, but I don't think this will be Estevan's toughest test. And Alan doesn't have Allen, he does have some decent calculated striking. He's got a flawless victory over Carlos Hernandez, who isn't elite whatsoever, but he made quick work of him. He threw a front kick up the middle to close the distance, took him down and submitted him. And versus Jake Hadley, Nascimento was able to sweep him 3 times in that fight. But again, Jake Hadley isn't elite. When it came to a strong wrestler like Tagir Ulanbekov, Alan Nascimento couldn't get up or reverse position. I think we'll see a lot of that heavy top pressure from Estevam here, where he gets the takedowns and controls him on the ground and gathers up control time, because Nascimento is vulnerable to getting taken down. But with some opponents, he's able to reverse them. But when it comes to high level grapplers, he has a hard time reversing positions and just lays on his back. And that's what Rafael Estevan is. He's a high level dominant grappler, crisp striking to set up those takedowns. With great cardio, has gone to distance multiple times in his career. I don't think the scrambling ability of Nascimento will be enough to avoid Estevan's ground control. I think we'll see Estevan use his strikes to set up the takedowns and control this fight on the ground. Because Estevan does have that dominant grappling, with crisp striking to set up those takedowns, and he has relentless top control. And while Allen is talented, he's scrambly. It's hard to get control of him, to get him on the ground. He struggles with dominant grapplers. He's got good submission instincts as well, but he struggles versus elite wrestlers. I think Estevan, his grappling dominance and control time should decide the rounds in this matchup. So I'm gonna side with Rafael. Moving on to our next fight, Siak Hyung Ko versus Philip Rowe. In my opinion, this is Siak Hyung Ko all day. He surprised everyone in his debut versus Oban Elliott, where he just ragdolled him for 3 rounds straight. Beat him in the striking exchanges as well. When you watch tape on him, you can tell that he's a good fighter, but at the time, for me, it wasn't convincing enough to convince me that he can beat Oban Elliott, because he hasn't done that to any high level athlete. So when we saw him put a wrestling clinic on Oban Elliott, that was more than enough to prove that he's legit, right? And Philip Rowe, he's a great fighter too. In his last fight versus Ange Lusa, he was down 2 rounds, getting out grappled. Then once Ange Lusa gassed out, Philip Rowe was able to pick up the pace, find the TKO victory. The thing is, I don't see Siak Hyung Ko gassing out like that. I think we'll see him dominate the wrestling exchanges once again, and it's not just his wrestling. His stand-up game is composed as well. He fights in a very smart and calculated way. He knows how to manage his distance and hit and not get hit. We saw Philip Rowe, he doesn't really react well when he's being pressured with the wrestling. And Siak Hyung Ko has he has a high level sambo background, right? With a high pace and overwhelming pressure. I believe Philip Rowe will have the height and reach advantage here, right? So he is going to look to use that here, but I just think we'll see this fight taking place with Ko's wrestling pressure and exploit Philip's poor defensive wrestling and put on another clinic. Because from what we've seen in his last fight, Siak Hyung Ko, he does have that high level sambo wrestling. He's got controlled pressure, and he's already impressed. In his UFC debut, where Philip Rowe did have that comeback in his last fight. And he's got the better cardio. Maybe he's got decent cardio, right? And he thrives when his opponents faded late. Based off of his last fight. But I just think the cardio of Siak Hyung Ko is going to be able to hold up. He's got the wrestling control and the pressure to neutralize Philip Rowe's any chance of having a late surge. In getting a chance, giving him a chance to get back in the fight. I don't think that's going to be able. I don't think Philip Rowe is going to be able to do that here, right? So I just think Siak Hyung Ko is going to be able to control this fight all 3 rounds. Moving on to our next fight. We got Ante Delija versus Waldo Cortes-Acosta. I'm going to side with Ante Delija to win this fight, This is kind of a tough fight to call, though. You got Ante Delija, who just came into the UFC. Excuse me. Came into the UFC and he looked great in his debut. He didn't waste any time putting the pressure on. Landed a fast knockout shot, and it was truly stunning. He carries some serious power and speed. Even for a heavyweight. And on top of that, he's Tom Aspinall's training partner. He's teammates with Tom Aspinall, so he's getting great sparring rounds in with one of the greatest MMA fighters in the sport right now. On the other hand, you got Waldo Cortes-Acosta, who's much more experienced in the UFC level. 9 fights. He's won 7 of them. He's coming off of a loss to a dangerous striker where it looked like Waldo Cortez was in the fight the whole time, but he just kept getting caught with the better punch. I feel like he realized quickly that his opponent is holding much more power in his shots, and it was almost like Waldo Cortez Acosta was afraid to close the distance because the punishment for doing that was so severe. Waldo was trying to outpoint him while his opponent was just trying to land that big knockout shot. And Waldo, he didn't get knocked out, but he definitely got his hit. He definitely got hit with the more devastating shots. And one thing about Waldo is that he's never been finished, right? So he's got a chin on him. So maybe if Ante can't get him out of there in the first round, like what he did to Marcin Tybura in his last fight in his debut, we could see a fight where Waldo is able to outpoint him and outstrike him on the feet. But I think it's more likely we see a similar fight to Waldo's last fight, where Ante is an aggressive starter. He sets up the pace for the fight with his power shots. He even mixes in his ground game in his fights, sometimes as well, so he has that option as well if he wants to. And I just didn't like how hesitant Waldo looked against a heavy power puncher. It was like he was almost afraid to engage because of the power threat coming back. I don't think we'll see Ante get a knockout here. Waldo has good footwork and he doesn't stay in the pocket longer than he should. He's gonna look to stick and move, but I'm sure Ante has the more powerful striking. When he lands, it will mean more in the eyes of the judges, and he'll have the bigger moments, I believe. And Ante even has that wrestling pressure in his back pocket as well. So I'm gonna side with the more explosive heavyweight. The fast knockout ability. The elite power for his size in Delija. And he's training partners with Tom Aspinall. While Waldo is experienced and he's a durable veteran at this point, he's able to stick and move and he's never been finished. I just think Delija is going to hold the more power, and the early aggression is going to create the best path to victory here. And it's likely he'll pick up the bigger moments early on, and that will make Waldo a bit more hesitant, because we saw Waldo doesn't really react well to those big power shots. He fights back, he stays in the fight, but he becomes a bit more hesitant. And I think Delija is going to be able to recreate something similar to what we saw in Waldo's last fight, where Waldo was a bit hesitant in throwing because of the big power strikes, the big powerful shots coming back. And Delija looked really impressive in his last fight as well. So I'll side with Delija here. Moving on to Themba Gorimbo versus Jeremiah Wells. This was also a tough pick. I'm gonna side with Jeremiah Wells here. Because look, I'm a big fan of Themba Gorimbo. He's a good dude. Dwayne Johnson bought him a house to support him. I'm rooting for him here. He's not a bad fighter, at all. He's got suffocating wrestling pressure against the fence, and he's a nice technical striker, good striking defense. His wrestling defense is decent as well, and I feel like he's going to need that wrestling defense here, because Jeremiah is going to be looking for those takedowns. He's a strong dude, built like a tank, and he has explosive striking. It's hard to take him down. He uses his explosive striking to set up those double leg takedowns. I think his strength and his body type will allow him to take control of this fight. I think he's the stronger individual in this matchup, and that will allow him to dictate whether this fight is on the ground or not. And being the shorter and stronger fighter, I feel like he can get in on the hips easier of Themba. I think the first round or two, Jeremiah is going to be exploding with his strikes, trying to land the harder shots, then shoot for takedowns, put up a grueling pace early on, but towards the end of the fight, we're going to see him fatigue a bit. While Gorimbo might have a hard time out wrestling Jeremiah, who's built like a tank and he's strong as hell, I think on the feet we're gonna see Gorimbo get outstruck and having to defend takedowns. I think the volume and activity for Jeremiah early on in this fight is going to be too overwhelming for Gorimbo to deal with. So I think Jeremiah will do enough landing the better shots and shooting for takedowns. I think that was gonna be enough for him to win at least the first 2 rounds. Because while Gorimbo does have good striking, a technical striking, and he's a technical wrestler with suffocating fence pressure and he's composed, I think Jeremiah is way too strong and explosive. And he's a heavy hitter, with good scrambles as well, with intent to take you down. He puts up a grueling pace. So I think the early explosion of Jeremiah and the pressure is more likely to win him the rounds. I think in the first half of this fight, it's going to be enough to outwork Themba Gorimbo. But I do hope I'm wrong. I like Gorimbo, but I just think Jeremiah has what it takes to pull it off. Because it in his last fight with Max Griffin, it was a split decision, right? It was a close fight, and before that, he had a loss to Charlton Harrison. His name is something like that, and I feel like Jeremiah was doing so well in that fight. He was winning that fight until he just got caught in the choke, and then he got put to sleep. So I think as long as he doesn't get submitted like how he did, or doesn't gas out and then get submitted like how he did, um, Jeremiah should have the tools to have the better moments in this fight. But we'll see. I'm gonna pick Jeremiah Wells to win this fight. Moving on to our main event, Steve Garcia versus David Onama. Really close fight. I'm gonna pick David Onama to win this fight. You can't deny the run that these two guys have been on. 6 fight win streak for Steve Garcia, 4 fight win streak for David Onama, but both guys, they're on an absolute heater, right? Garcia, the mean machine, he's gonna come forward, be aggressive, attempt to land clean power shots, decent takedown offense and defense. Though he much prefers to strike. David Onama's got some decent power in his shots as well, and it's been David Onama's striking has been a lot more technical lately, right? Garcia is known for his pressure striking, putting up volume to overwhelm his opponents, puts up a high pace, but Onama has never been finished, right? So if he doesn't finish um, Onama, he's gonna have to outstrike him, right, and outpoint him. But Onama can strike as well. I feel like he's more willing to mix in his grappling as well. David might be the better David might have the better striking defense as well over the course of the fight. One thing to note as well, both of David Onama's losses have come by fighters who relied heavily on their wrestling. He was repeatedly taken down by Nate Landwehr and Mason Jones. These guys are wrestlers first. We haven't seen any striker really trouble David on the feet, and he's never been finished, whereas Steve Garcia has been finished. I'm not saying we're going to see a finish in this fight, but despite Steve Garcia having so much success in knocking people out in the UFC, I don't think we're going to see him get a knockout here. And I think we're going to see a tactical and composed game plan throughout the fight from David Onama. Keep it measured on the feet, manage distance well, and mix in the wrestling and win a decision. Because Steve Garcia, he's finishing people. He's got relentless pressure as a striker, high volume finisher on a long run. But I just think Onama is more technical, composed, and can mix in wrestling and striking exchanges, and he's really tough to finish. And we've only ever seen Onama get have trouble, get losses in his career to heavy wrestlers. I just think David Onama is gonna have a measured game plan. His defense is gonna look good. I think he's gonna have the cleaner output to win a tactical decision in this matchup. It should be a good fight though. That does conclude this week's picks for UFC Fight Night David Norma versus Steve Garcia. So let me know what you guys thought. Let me know who you guys are rolling with. Drop your predictions down below. And let me know if you agree or disagree with my picks. I really love to see what you guys thought. As always, I hope you guys are doing well. Hope you guys have a great day. I love you guys. That's it for me. I'm out. Peace.